The next biogeochemical cycle that we are going to discuss is the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is an element that is vital to living organisms for a few reasons. Phosphorus is an important component of cell membranes. If you remember back to living environment or biology, the phospholipid bilayer makes up the cell membrane of organisms and many organelles as well. It forms a portion of DNA and RNA molecules. If you remember, the phosphate sugar in the base of nucleotides is phosphorus in it. Also ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the molecule that is often used in providing energy, transferring energy from one form to another in living organisms. So phosphorus is really important. Often in terrestrial plants, it is the second most limiting nutrient. Typically nitrogen is the first limiting nutrient, and then phosphorus. That can, if it is deficient, can limit the growth of producers. In aquatic ecosystems, often we see phosphorus as the primary limiting nutrient because it's not as soluble in water as some of the forms of nitrogen are. So often phosphorus is limiting in aquatic ecosystems. So if we consider, the flows and fluxes and reservoirs, pools of phosphorus in ecosystems, the main flows that drive the phosphorus cycle is the weathering of rock, the breakdown of rock over time by elements, excretion from animals. An important source of phosphorus is guano. Guano is a name that's given to the excrement of birds and bats. And before humans developed ways of producing synthetic phosphorus fertilizers, guano was the main way that in agriculture we could add phosphorus to improve yields agriculturally. So guano was sought out, it was harvested, it was shipped around the world. In fact, it even was responsible for wars over the guano, especially on small islands that were colonized by large numbers of birds, and caves where bats were present in large numbers. When organisms die and decompose, their phosphorus can be returned into the soil and then be taken up in assimilation of different organisms. And also in the oceans, dissolved phosphates can precipitate out, form solids, and can sink to the bottom of the oceans. The main pools or reservoirs of phosphorus that we see in ecosystems, rocks and sediment, dissolved in the water, typically as phosphate, and also within the body tissues of living organisms. So if we imagine a model here of the phosphorus cycle, we can look at some of those flows and fluxes. Okay? We can see phosphate that is dissolved in the water here, and that phosphate can come from decomposition of organisms. Okay? It can come from a runoff in streams and rivers. It can come from the erosion and weathering of rocks, which release phosphorus into rivers and streams. Plants absorb phosphate through the soil and through their roots and store it in their tissues. Other aquatic plants take up phosphates that are dissolved in the water. When those organisms die, some of them decompose and some of the materials can sink to the bottom of the ocean. Some of them can stay dissolved in the water. Also, that sediment can eventually form rock, and then that phosphate is locked up in those rocks for a while until it can be weathered away again. So this is a general picture of the phosphorus cycle. And again, as we said when we were talking about nitrogen, the phosphorus pollution, excess phosphorus that is runs off into bodies of water can be dangerous because it is a limiting nutrient. And so we might think, well, nutrients, those must be good for organisms, must be good for ecosystems, but an excess of nutrients can actually be harmful to ecosystems. And we see that. Here's an example of an area where phosphorus pollution has had a significant impact. So Clearly, if you see the outlines of the states, you recognize that this is the Gulf of Mexico, and the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico. But the Mississippi River, which runs from north to south through the Midwest of the U.S., that is an area in which agriculture is an important industry in much of that area. And so industrial agriculture uses large amounts of fertilizer, which contain phosphorus as well as nitrogen and other materials as well. And so that fertilizer, if excess fertilizer is applied and it runs off into the water, or if synthetic fertilizers are more soluble than organic fertilizer, if they run off into rivers and streams and lakes, eventually all of those lakes and streams and rivers funnel their tributaries of the Mississippi River. And so that all ends up in the Mississippi River, which eventually empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And what happens is we have nutrient pollution here along the Gulf, along the shoreline, which, as we talked about earlier, these excess nutrients encourage the growth of algae, which grow very quickly. We call these algae blooms. And those algae, they block sunlight from reaching farther into the water, harming producers that are below them. And also, as those algae die, they have a relatively short life cycle. Their decomposition by bacteria and other decomposers requires oxygen. And so those decomposers suck oxygen out of the water, leading to very low oxygen conditions, which can be harmful for many aquatic organisms. Another source I forgot to mention of phosphorus is detergents, soaps, laundry detergent, etc. They often contain phosphorus, and when they go into our wastewater, if they're untreated, if they're not removed, then those phosphates can leach into the water as well.